Welcome, everyone. Tonight's class, we're going to continue on the 4 books, and we'll be dealing with Mencius's section, his works, and it's his book 4, part 1, that Michael Hill will be leading tonight, and I like to make. Hello.
You're good.
Okay. Today is a special day for me, and I've only shared it with 2 other people. I haven't even mentioned it to Nancy today. But today is the 25th day, marking the 25th day 25th year, pardon me, that I left Coca-Cola. And it was 2 days ago that it just came, and I thought, oh my gosh. And when I left Coke, one of the last things I did was talk to my very old boss, who was very, very consoling to me, and said, well, there is life after Coke. And I said, gee, thanks, Kim. You're so sensitive. You blah, 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 blah. And I said, that's not what I expected from you. I just wanted to just say I had no ill feelings, and that was it. But I will say this, in retrospect, the life after Coke was life. And I think you understand what I mean, because it was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. And I came up with the plan to not go back into corporate stuff after going through this whole exercise. And Michael, I think you know what I'm talking about. Through a counselor, they give you all these things that you've got as benefits when you separate like that after so many years. But I decided I was going to go into business, and 2 businesses, consulting and antiques. And what came about out of that was all the pressure of all the changes and the economic situation and all those other kind of things that go with it. Dramatic change after being with a job for almost 25 years. And that's how I found the pressure of those 2 companies I started led me to see an article in the newspaper, which led me to the temple. And so I'm very grateful for that opportunity yeah, there is life after Coca-Cola, Raj. And that's the life that I'm so grateful for. So, and I'm sure each and every person here, given the opportunity, would have a story that that we should all share at one time or another with our Dowkin. And I'm taking this opportunity tonight, and I'm just so grateful for this 25th anniversary. But then the other thing the other point I want to make is it will be 25 years since I received the blessing, August 21st of this year. And that's really what I'm celebrating tonight. And in this class, I'm celebrating the fact that we have had so many people participate as leaders, and never having done that before, organized things and spoken in a class. And I'm so grateful for being able to participate in those kind of things. And this is what life is all about in my estimation. So that's my little message for tonight. I took 5 minutes, and may I ask Aram to give us any kind of highlights that you might wish to share with us all?
Yeah, first, congratulations on your silver jubilee of freedom. Life begins when we put the butcher knife down, right? That's how I see rest of the things. Everyone, please keep your cameras turned off and devices muted. If you need to make a comment, please turn on your camera or make get attention from the speaker, so speaker allow you to make a comment. Once you're done, turn off your camera and go back to the mute mode. We are recording our class for the Stishu Library, so I wanted to make sure everybody's aware of that. Try not to press unnecessary buttons, especially the stop recording button. That is all from my side. Back to you, Roger.
Thank you. Yeah, the butcher knife is part of it, but and that was part of many conversations today that I did not bring up that other people brought up, who I never met before. So thanks for that opportunity to bring that up. That's extremely important, and having been shared with us today by Master Huang, the installation of Qigong teachers, July admonition and song. I just want to reiterate the importance of that vegetarian vow, and then a family temple. And as I look, most everybody that's on board tonight, I take that back. I'd say about 60%, maybe, have family temples at this time. And I pray to God that those opportunities will open up to you as well. So we know our brother Michael, I think, pretty well. He's very active. He recently, like so few of us who went to Nepal, were able to, we thought, give great service, and we found out that the service that we received and the learnings that we received were, at least from my perspective, beyond my wildest expectations. And I'm very grateful for that, because it is humbling for the country, the people in the neighborhood, and just everything that was extended to us of people we didn't even know. But Michael was the upper angel for the inauguration of the temple, and led all the ceremony and the Tao receiving ceremonies for the temple during that 4 days that we had, the 1 day and the 3-day Dharma class, plus his other responsibility as an instructor. So he and that's not the only opportunity. He's very active, as you all know, in the temple and serving and cutting grass and doing everything that needs to be done. He seems to be available more often than so many of us, and we're grateful for that, and we're grateful for his leadership tonight. So that's all I'll say, Michael, and I've given you a little bit more time.
Okay.
And I offer this opening for you right now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Brother Roger. I'll just make a quick comment about Nepal. As Brother Roger mentioned, I think I won't speak for everybody, but I think the sentiment is that we got as much out of the trip as what we hope the people there receive from us participating. And I think we all agreed that the people of Nepal touched our hearts. And, aside from the responsibilities that we had inside the temple, Dr. Lin felt it was important that we were part of an effort to convince important influencers in the community that we participate in discussions with them. And so I think maybe some of you have seen the photos of us going to the school where Dr. Lin was teaching Chinese to the students. Several of us, Barbara, Roger, and myself, we had an opportunity to speak to the 150 students who were assembled during the General Assembly. So we shared just some brief comments with the students. We came back in the afternoon on that first day to speak again with the principal of the school because he speaks very good English. And so Dr. Lin has a communication issue with him. And so he wanted to take advantage of us being there. Also with the Pointmaster Kwong there, she could translate for Dr. Lin. So we were engaged in kind of an effort to influence the influencers. And then, of course, then we invited them for the grand opening ceremony. And because so many of them from the school were going to be attending, we decided to hold a one-day Dharma class. So last minute, we had to prepare for lectures for the one-day Dharma class. And then I think on the Tuesday, I think the second day of the 3-day Dharma class, the principal came back again with the vice principal. We had some more discussions with him. And so we participated in a lot of things to help get I guess the temple properly established, and hopefully they can continue the effort moving forward. So that was my comments, my thoughts from the trip from Nepal. But I thought it was a great experience personally, and of course we were able to make some contributions. All of us were able to make contributions for establishing and then, establishing the temple in the 3-day Dharma class. So before I begin, I'd just like to give thanks for the grace of God. Thanks for the great mercy of our Grand Master, Mila Buddha. Thanks for the great virtue of our patriarch and matriarch. Thanks for the perseverance of our Bai Shui Shangdi, Wensa Buddhasava, Lingwa Buddhasava for all the hardships that they had to endure. Thanks to our Point Master Zhang and all the forerunners from Taiwan in supporting our efforts propagating Tao in America. Thanks for our Jayun Zhenjun, our Qingwei Pusa, Yunrong Shenzhen, Jimin Tenchen, Jie Tianchen, and Ida Zhangjun, who are all in heaven watching over us. Thanks to all our point masters in the United States for their encouragement and support. And thanks to my introducer and guarantor. And of course, lastly, thanks to all of you for being here this evening, giving me the opportunity to present this topic. So we're continuing with our study of the 4 books, and specifically, we're reviewing the works of Mencius at the moment. And my presentation tonight will cover the first part of book 7, which is entitled Li Lao 1, and that's on pages 424 to 436. And for those of you who don't have a copy of this, I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation with those passages, so that I'll be sharing all of that with you. Before I begin, I'd just like to make a brief comment. This book is a little bit different than the other preceding books in that predominantly Mencius is the speaker here. And it's very much a collection of his quotations. And many of these are just, pithy observations that contain kind of a general truth. And reading reviews and stuff, it's kind of said that this book doesn't have the same thematic coherence of some of the other books of Mencius, and it also doesn't have the dramatic biographical content like some of the other books. So as a result, this one may seem less memorable, but it includes a number of what some may call philosophically interesting passages. And in general, this book makes the argument that good governance is achieved by looking back to and respecting past kings and sages. And it's distinguished by a strong emphasis on the importance of tradition and reverence for the past. So, as I mentioned, I prepared a PowerPoint presentation, so let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And let me know if you see this.
Yes.
Okay. So let me begin with chapter 1, and we'll do the, I guess, the first 6 points. So Mencius said, the power and vision of Li Lao and skill of hand of Kung Shu without the compass and square could not form squares and circles. the acute ear of the music master Kwong, without the pitch tubes, could not determine correctly the 5 notes. The principles of Yao and Shun, without a benevolent government, could not secure the tranquil order of the kingdom. There are now princes who have benevolent hearts and a reputation for benevolence, while yet the people do not receive any benefits from them, nor will they leave any example to future ages. All because they do not put into practice the ways of the ancient kings. Hence, we have the saying, virtue alone is not sufficient for the exercise of government. Laws alone cannot carry themselves into practice. It is said in the book of poetry, without transgression, without forgetfulness, following the ancient statutes. Never has anyone fallen into error who followed the laws of the ancient kings. When the sages had used the vigor of their eyes, they called into their aid the compass, the square, the level, and the line, to make things square, round, level, and straight. The use of the instruments is inexhaustible. When they had used their power of hearing to the utmost, they called in the pitch tubes to their aid to determine the 5 notes. The use of those tubes is inexhaustible. When they had exerted to the utmost the thoughts of their hearts, they called in to their aid a government that could not endure to witness the sufferings of men, and their benevolence overspread the kingdom. Hence, we have the saying, to raise a thing high, we must begin from the top of a mound or a hill. To dig to a great depth, we must commence in the low ground of a stream or a marsh. Can he be pronounced wise who, in the exercise of government, does not proceed according to the ways of former kings? So just a few quick notes here. The reference to the 5 notes refers to the relative tones of the pentatonic scale, right? And this is a musical scale with 5 notes per octave. And these were developed independently by many ancient civilizations and are still used in various musical styles to this day. What we commonly use today are a heptatonic scale, which has 7 notes per octave, like the major and minor scales. Secondly, he mentioned several names. So Li Lao was a legendary figure. He was famous for keen sight. Kung Shu was a craftsman of Lu during the spring and autumn period. And then Master Kwong, he was a music master. His name was Shi, Music Master Shi, was well known as an outstanding musician. So in the opening passage, Mencius is employing this argument from the Analects. So just as one cannot draw a perfect circle without a compass, regardless of one's natural skill in drawing, there are certain fields in which natural talent and enthusiasm are insufficient for success. So Mencius applies this point to the art of governance, right? So rulers may have good intentions and may even have innate aptitude, but these will amount to little unless they take advantage of the way of the ancient kings. So this demonstrates the necessity of following proven past rules, right? The former kings were exemplary leaders. Therefore, if a ruler follows their example, their state too will flourish. So I'll stop here and ask if anybody had a comment that they'd like to share.
I do. I have to bring up the fact of the tools, the compass, the square, the level, the ruler.
Okay.
These are all the tools of Masonic order. You know, the compass gives you the ability to, as you said, create a most perfect circle. It's a way of describing perfection of the individual. Square is, you know, many people have heard it, I think. Gee, he's a perfection. He's on square. You know, so it's used to show how somebody is truthful, the square. The ruler is important because it gives boundaries, it gives scale, so you can see your progress. We talk about cultivation all the time. It's part of that. And then the line, we always talk about on the path, and the line can be, as Einstein described a line is just a dot that goes on into infinity, and it will come back to its original point. So it goes from a point to a line to a circle, literally, coming back to itself. So all these, I was enamored with the whole fact that these tools were brought up in Mencius's time, as they are throughout the Western teachings, which is what Masonic things are. It's all Western teachings and Egyptian and Judaic teachings and all those Sumatran teachings and all these things incorporated into the Masonic use of these tools for development, for cultivation. So this empowered me greatly hearing Mencius talk about it. That's my only comment.
Okay, well, thank you, Roger. Anybody else?
Oh, I will add one last thing.
Sure.
If anybody wants to know, just look up the Masonic symbol. It's a compass over and a square, and in the middle, you'll see a dot or a G, and the G represents God. So within perfection is God or spirit.
Interesting. Okay. Anybody else before I move on? Okay. Therefore, only the benevolent ought to be in high stations. When a man destitute of benevolence is in a high station, he thereby disseminates his wickedness among all below him. When the prince has no principles by which he examines his administration, and his ministers have no laws by which they keep themselves in the discharge of their duties, then in the court obedience is not paid to principle, and in the office obedience is not paid to rule. Superiors violate the laws of righteousness, and inferiors violate the penal laws. It is only by a fortunate chance that a state in such a case is preserved. Therefore, it is said, it is not the exterior and interior walls being incomplete, and the supply of weapons, offensive and defensive, not being large, which constitutes the calamity of a kingdom. It is not the cultivable area not being extended, and stores and wealth not being accumulated, which occasions the ruin of a state. When superiors do not observe the rules of propriety, and inferiors do not learn, then seditious people spring up, and that state will perish in no time. It is said in the book of poetry, when such an overthrow of Chow is being produced by heaven, be not ye so much at your ease, that is dilatory. And so dilatory may those officers be deemed, who serve their prince without righteousness, who take office and retire from it without regard to propriety, and who in their words disown the ways of the ancient kings. Therefore, it is said, to urge one's sovereign to difficult achievements may be called showing respect for him. To set before him what is good and repress his perversities may be called showing reverence for him. He who does not do these things, saying to himself, my sovereign is incompetent to this, may be said to play the thief with him. So Mencius's argument is then used in a kind of a broader justification for a certain kind of traditionalism, or you could say social conservatism, right? So conserving the past. And so he's stressing that there's something superficial and disrespectful about criticizing former kings and ancestors. So in summary, this chapter is basically presenting us with Mencius's viewpoint that there's an art of government, as well as a wish to govern well. And these are to be learned from the example and principles of the ancient kings and sages. And thus, these are required to be studied and practiced by rulers and their ministers in order to be successful leaders of their subjects. Did anybody have a question or a comment that they'd like to share with us?
Hey, Brother Michael.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
Or Mr. Kwong, okay.
In here, he talked about there's certain rules or ways of government, how an emperor should, what model they should look after. Actually, it reminded me of some of the books or dramas I had watched before. It reminded me because there are emperors at that time later on. Okay, it's not as ancient, not 2,000 years ago, maybe about 500 or 1,000 years. They refer to the learning of the kingly way, and that's what they taught the ones that who they think will inherit the throne. They will have the scholars come to the palace, and if the emperor's favorite son or something, they said they want to mold him into the next heir to the throne, they would teach him the kingly way. So it just reminded me what Mencius is talking about here, about I believe those the knowledge that they were specially being taught to the heir to the throne per se.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else?
Brother Michael, I have a question about the last sentence.
Okay.
When they play the thief with him, could you elaborate a little more? I'm not sure what it really means.
Well, my thought would be that it's kind of like you're stealing, right? So so they're talking about, so if you're disrespecting your sovereign, your leader, then you're actually, you're not an honest person, in other words. So you're actually stealing from that person. So you're dishonest in that sense. So, and I think it comes back to the comment about Mencius stresses that there's something superficial and disrespectful about criticizing former kings and ancestors. And, I don't know if I'll speak to this later, but Mencius has this view of, and it's from his time. And so they're looking at the past in a period of more tranquility, and they're using both historical and maybe even some mythical figures who were the kings and sages at that time, in the more tranquil times. They're holding them up as being the ideal rulers and leaders of the people. And so, if you're being disrespectful to them, then I think then he's looking down on that. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. So we'll go to the next chapter, chapter 2. So Mencius said, the compass and square produce perfect circles and squares. By the sages, the human relations are perfectly exhibited. He who are as a sovereign would perfectly discharge the duties of a sovereign, and he who as a minister would perfectly discharge the duties of a minister, have only to imitate the one Yao and the other Shun. He who does not serve his sovereign as Shun served Yao does not respect his sovereign, and he who does not rule his people as Yao ruled his injures his people. Confucius said, there are but two courses which can be pursued, that of virtue and its opposite. A ruler who carries the oppression of his people to the highest pitch will himself be slain, and his kingdom will perish. If one stops short of the highest pitch, his life will notwithstanding be in danger, and his kingdom will be weakened. He will be styled the dark or the cruel, and though he may have filial sons and affectionate grandsons, they will not be able in 100 generations to change the designation. So this is these opening 4 passages is basically a continuation of the previous chapter about, the art of government. And so Mencius is specifically referencing 2 individuals. They're Yao and Shun, right? And Yao and Shun are the perfect models of sovereign and minister. And that's who he's holding up as the model. And then Mencius describes the consequences of not imitating them, right? So in the fourth passage, that's the consequence of not following this model. Did anybody have a comment or a question that they'd like to ask?
Well, number 4, Mark,
Yeah.
Michael.
Yep.
To me, that's such a strong warning.
Yep.
Consequences, and I thought even for Mencius that seemed to be pretty strong. 7 generations, and then 9 generations of ancestors won't be able to correct that. Wow, that's that label of cruelty. That's really a strong thing to say.
And remember, you see these citations of the dark or the cruel. I think, was it starting in the Zhou dynasty? So when somebody was given the title of a king, it would be like King Benevolent or King whatever, And so they were given this title with a characterization of their rule. And so they're talking about the dark. So you'd be the king of the dark or king the cruel, And so your offspring would have to live with that for many generations, right? So,
or kill part of new dynasty to change.
Yeah.
Oh, Brother Michael, it's 100
Yes.
generations.
Yeah.
100 generations, not 9, not 7.
Right. So, yeah. So
100.
we'd have to live with that forever, basically, right? So, okay. Quite the warning. Okay. Anybody else like to share a comment or a thought? Okay. This is what is intended in the words of the Book of Poetry. The beacon of Yin is not remote. It is in the time of the last sovereign of Shah. So, of course, there's many citations to the Book of Poetry, and so this one is it's Ode 255. So, I don't know if you have it available, but it's Ode 255, and it provides the sense that the fall of a prior dynasty should serve as a cautionary warning to the newly elevated line of kings, because the fall of the previous dynasty is relatively not that far off from the present dynasty. And so here I wanted to share an observation from an author. His name is Robert Eno, and he translated the works of Mencius. And so he made this comment. In other chapters, we see Mencius discourse at length on details of political history that supposedly describe the practical governance measures of past kings. And as I mentioned previously, they're both historical and mythical. But chapters like this one remind us that Mencius was not simply an ethical or political philosopher, right? He physically traveled to these various royal courts. And his mission was to present a set of concrete state policies that he believed would transform these provincial hereditary lords into world-conquering monarchs. And So when he mentions these, when he makes references to like the way of the former kings, he's not just gesturing in general terms to like moral virtues, like, you know, being humane or whatever. He's basically legitimizing his particular policy recommendations by tying them to historical exemplars who were said to be moral and who were, obviously, they were successful in their rule. So I'll stop here and ask if anybody would like to share a comment or a thought. Okay. We'll move on to chapter 3. Mencius said, "It was by benevolence that the 3 dynasties gained the throne, and by not being benevolent that they lost it. It is by the same means that the decaying and flourishing, the preservation and perishing of states are determined. If the sovereign be not benevolent, he cannot preserve the throne from passing from him. If the head of a state be not benevolent, he cannot preserve his rule. If a high noble or great officer be not benevolent, he cannot preserve his ancestral temple. If a scholar or common man be not benevolent, he cannot preserve his 4 limbs. Now they hate death and ruin, and yet delight in being not benevolent. This is like hating to be drunk, and yet being strong to drink wine." Okay. So in essence, this chapter is presenting the importance to, you know, to everyone, but specifically to the rulers, of exercising benevolence, having benevolence. So here Mencius is equating benevolence to flourishing and preservation, and not having benevolence equating to decaying and perishing. And I want to come back to Robert Eno again, because he makes another interesting point about Mencius's worldview of history. And because the works of Mencius is very much a text of its time, so it's taking place in this time, and it was written for the audience who has the shared understanding of the history and the culture of that period. So the period when Mencius lived was part of what was known as the Warring States era. And it was an era of endemic war between, you know, powerful regional political entities, you know, in the area that we now call China. And for Mencius and his contemporaries, the period was not seen only as a chaotic time, you know, as filled with violence and misery, but as a lapse from earlier periods of peace and unity. And so this was the peace and unity was a period that was presided over by a single strong ruling house, which was the Zhou dynasty. And so the goal of Mencius and others like him was finding a way to a future that restored the peace and unity of the past. And most of Mencius's theoretical, philosophical positions were taken in the service of that pragmatic goal, which was to restore back to peace and unity. So to understand Mencius, it's important to understand his goal, right? And he was also looking back towards the image of the ideal past. And so Eno makes the argument that the image was in part based on both myth and imagination, but a substantial component was certainly grounded in real events. So in historical terms, the actual basis for Mencius's belief in an era of past order was the early Zhou dynasty. So did anybody have a comment that they'd like to share or have a question?
Well, verse number 3 of that.
Yeah.
To me,
Okay.
when you read it, you know, it talks really about the trickle down of benevolence, or the trickle down or impact that the ruler has within the rank and order, all the way down to the civilians. And I just didn't laugh at that. I laughed at the last one, verse 4. Now they hate death and ruin, and yet delight in being not benevolent. This is like hating to be drunk and yet being strong to drink wine, you know. I mean, oh my gosh, you know, how many people do you know or have I known who say,
Yeah.
"Ah, I'm drunk all the time, but you know, I do it." Well, okay. Well, being benevolent or not being benevolent is just as destructive. And again, that's a very strong warning, I think, that Mencius is saying based on grounded history. You know, you don't follow the trickle down order of being benevolent. You're gonna fall into ruin. And again, this is the strongest point he's made, and we've only gone over a couple of pages at this point.
Right, and it's based on, you know, historical precedent, right? Because a lot of this is based on historical facts. So so he's using it in a very powerful way to try to influence and advise these royal courts to rule benevolently for the people. But it's also interesting because you pointed out point 3. Later on, you'll see Mencius is talking about more of a trickle up effect. I won't get into that now, but so you're talking about the trickle down from the ruler down to the individual. But later on in the chapter, he's talking about the trickle up effect. You know, you start with the individual. So anybody else have a comment that they'd like to share? Okay, so chapter 4. Mencius said, if a man love others and no responsive attachment is shown to him, let him turn inwards and examine his own benevolence. If he is trying to rule others and his government is unsuccessful, let him turn inwards and examine his wisdom. If he treats others politely and they do not return his politeness, let him turn inwards and examine his own feeling of respect. When we do not, by what we do, realize what we desire, we must turn inwards and examine ourselves in every point. When a man's person is correct, the whole kingdom will turn to him with recognition and submission. It is said in the book of poetry, be always studious to be in harmony with the ordinances of God, and you will obtain much happiness. So let me summarize this chapter with this statement, right? And you've probably heard this one before. What measure one metes out to others, thus it will be measured to oneself in return, right? So what measure one metes out to others, thus it will be measured to oneself in return. And consequently, before one deals with others, right? So not expecting them to be affected by us, one should first deal with oneself. And this is what we refer to as self-reflection, right? So we're reviewing our thoughts, our attitudes, you know, our words and our behaviors, and we're doing that regularly. So this is what Mencius is prescribing here, in essence, is self-reflection. And he's relentless in focusing moral responsibility on the individual itself. So if the task is self-perfection, right, the moral qualities of others are not relevant to this. Followers of Confucius typically insist on the belief that virtue is charismatic and will elicit a positive response from others, and thereby, you know, ultimately working to transform the world towards virtue. But if that is not occurring, it can only be interpreted as a symptom of imperfect self-cultivation. And the implication is that one must increase one's own effort at self-reform. So in order to make oneself more perfect. And I'll stop here. Does anybody have a comment they'd like to share or thought?
Hey, Brother Michael,
Yes. Mhm.
this reminds me when I first came to the temple and Point Master C always tell us to look inward, look
Yeah.
inward.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I
we're talking
remember.
about the same thing.
I remember those words. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's self-reflection, I think is what he's prescribing here. So did anybody else like to share a thought or a comment before moving on? Okay, we'll go to chapter 5. So Mencius said, people have this common saying, the state, or the kingdom, the state, the family. The root of the kingdom is in the state. The root of the state is in the family. The root of the family is in the person of its head. So Eno usually had cited that usually Mencius would only have used 2 levels in this discussion. So he would have only mentioned the kingdom and the state, but he used 3 levels, which is the kingdom, the state, and the family. And the message here is that the return to a harmonious, utopian, unifying society of the past lies in the transformation of individuals to become moral actors, so that they act in a moral way. And of course, the most critical individual being the head of the family. That's what it says, the last sentence here. The root of the family is in the person of its head. So he's coming back, and this is where I mentioned just briefly previously about trickle up effect, right? So you're talking about the family unit, and who's in charge of the family unit. It's the head of the household. And so you have to start with that individual being, virtuous and benevolent and those things. So I'll stop here and see if anybody had a comment they'd like to share about this passage.
Well, Lake comment
Yeah,
in
go
another
ahead.
book, and he says personal character is necessary to all good influences. So that covers everything, not just the 3, which he's talking about here, but it covers everything, right?
Yeah.
Individual responsibility. It also
Individual, exactly, individual. So
yeah, and then his other comment is the kingdom is made up of component states and of their component families. The families of great officers or great leaders, you might say. But Mencius, as you just said, takes it further in a general way, but also specific, and he brings up the head of the family, like you said. And so I think it's a very small chapter, but when I was going through this, I started a couple of times thinking it was pretty critical, this little bitty comment.
all right, thank you, Brother Roger. Anybody else?
Hey, Brother Michael,
Yes.
do you remember that Westminster Abbey, that tombstone, that story I share about what it said? Remember that? The young man thinking that he was going to change the world, and then he found out that he can't. So he said, I'm going to change my country.
Oh.
And then he found out he can't.
Yeah.
He said he was going to change his family, and then said, I can't. They don't listen to me. And then he found out, okay, I have to change myself. I have to do it from me first, and then I can influence my family. Then I maybe have the chance to influence my society or community, and then my country, and then the world. So I think Mencius is talking about the same thing here.
Yes. Okay, very good. Anybody else?
Yes, Brother Michael, Sister Aramir.
Yes.
I was actually reading right now a book, not right now, but it's from Al-Ghazali, is the philosopher, Islamic world, and was reading on marriage, and it was mentioning the same thing where they were saying what will be bigger or more meritorious than the religious war or, fighting against evil. And it says, working, to feed and clothe your one's wife and children properly. So providing them has higher standard in God's eyes than going for something you're doing it for yourself. Because I mean, if you're doing it something for religious reason, you're doing it for yourself. But if you're providing your family, that's more of a selfless action when you're providing to others. So it was putting family before that.
There again, the head of the household, right? So
Yeah.
right. Okay. Anybody else? How are we doing on time there? Okay, 8:22. Okay. So
Yeah.
okay. All right. So chapter 6. Mencius said, the administration of government is not difficult. It lies in not offending the great families. Right? He whom the great families affect will be affected by the whole state. And he whom any one state affects will be affected by the whole kingdom. When this is the case, such an one's virtue and teachings will spread over all within the 4 seas like the rush of water. So this chapter appears to be kind of a fragment of a larger discussion. And so when he's talking about great families, who is he talking about? He's talking about the aristocratic, right? The hereditary elite, right? These are the powerful families of nobility. And just by birth, you're part of this. So, and the chapter seems to give preference to their views over those that a ruler might hear from his own appointees, right? So think of this. A ruler's appointees would have been approved by the ruler on the basis of their merit rather than on their birth. And followers of Confucius are generally advocates of meritocracy, right? So they believe in merit versus heredity. And they also believed in the interests of the socially mobile class of what's referred to as Shi, which are the scholars and warriors who had earned rather than inherited the title of, nobility. But here, or actually in the works of Mencius, sometimes they view these appointees with suspicion, so that they have some ulterior motive for attaining those positions. So in this current passage, the point being made may merely be a kind of a practical one, right? And this might be an example of what some may refer to as realpolitik, right? And because it's being done based on the situation and the material. It's not based on like a certain ethical practice or standard. And so there are other factors involved, and that's what's referred to as realpolitik. And this is something that Mencius is sometimes criticized for, is this, I think they call it situational ethics, right? So his position seems to change based on the situation, but it may be just because the times are different, right? And so the situation has to be treated differently. So I would say a general summary of this chapter would be that Mencius is advising the importance to a ruler of securing the esteem and submission of the great families. Okay, so I'll stop here and ask if anybody had a thought or a comment that they'd like to share.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
The great families are influencers. They've got skin in the game. The appointees have a different form of commitment or non-commitment, maybe from a new power-based standpoint, influencing standpoint in terms of the emperor, whereas the other families have a historical influence. So I think what he may be saying here, it's a little bit off, as you said, his normal perspective or position, but it would be wrong to discount those influencers of the big family because they're connected deep roots. And, you know, for the emperor to have effect, he has to have really the key families connected, or he may lose his power, his support, his weaponry, his soldiers. I mean, my God, he can change out his advisors, but he can't change out the influencers of the families deep rooted because of their ancestral connection to the emperor. So I think we need to look at it in a couple of ways like that. Maybe he's couching in a sense. Maybe I don't know. And maybe that's where the criticism is coming from. They think he's couching his bets there, or stepping back on his principles. I don't know. That's how I see it. I don't know. Power politics is something that I'm a pretty big failure at. So.
All right, thanks, Brother Roger. Anybody else? So chapter 7, Mencius said, when right government prevails in the kingdom, princes of little virtue are submissive to those of great, and those of little work to those of great. When bad government prevails in the kingdom, princes of small power are submissive to those of great, and the weak to the strong. Both these cases are the rule of heaven. They who accord with heaven are preserved, and they who rebel against heaven perish. So Mencius here, he's presenting the thought that the rule of the kingdom is determined by heaven, right? Whether the rule is good or whether it's bad, and that this is a natural and inevitable condition. So it's not that some high deity has ordered people to act, right, good or bad. It suggested that the Warring States period progressed. It became increasingly common to speak of heaven as a determined order in the world, meaning that the existing conditions bring about the corresponding result. Did anybody have a comment that they'd like to share before I move on? Okay. The Duke Ching of Qi said, not to be able to command others and at the same time to refuse to receive their commands is to cut one's self off from all intercourse with others. His tears flowed forth while he gave his daughter to be married to the Prince of Wu. So Duke Qing, he ruled in the era of Confucius. And so reportedly late in the reign of Duke Qing, the coastal state of Wu, which was in the lower reaches of the Yangtze River, they briefly became dominant. And so the power of Wu became a threat to Qi, where Duke Qing ruled. So thus the diplomatic marriage of a Qi princess to a semi-barbarian lord was arranged. And so you see, this was a painful submission by the king, right? So it says his tears flowed forth while he gave his daughter to be married to the Prince of Wu. Anybody have a comment that they'd like to share? Okay. Now the small states imitate the large and yet are ashamed to receive their commands. This is like a scholar's being ashamed to receive the commands of his master. For a prince who is ashamed of this, the best plan is to imitate King Wan. Let one imitate King Wan, and in 5 years, if his state be large, or in 7 years, if it be small, he will be sure to give laws to the kingdom. So here Mencius is making reference to King Wan. He's known as the cultured king, right? So that was his given title. but he wasn't really a king during his lifetime, right? He was known as Count Wan. And his son Wu was the one who conquered the Shang following the Battle of Muye. And so afterwards, Count Wan was posthumously honored as the founder of the Zhou dynasty. And then he was given this title of king. And many of the hymns of the classics of poetry are praises to the legacy of King Wan. And some consider him to be the first epic hero of Chinese history. So I'll stop here. Does anybody have a comment that they'd like to share about these two passages? Okay. It is said in the Book of Poetry, the descendants of the sovereigns of the Shang dynasty are in number more than hundreds of thousands, but God, having passed his decree, they are all submissive to Chao. They are submissive to Chao because the decree of heaven is not unchanging. The officers of Yin, admirable and alert, pour out the libations and assist in the capital of Chao. Confucius said, as against so benevolent a sovereign, they could not be deemed a multitude. Thus, if the prince of a state love benevolence, he will have no opponent in all the kingdom. So we know that heaven's decree is more familiarly used in English as like the mandate of heaven, right? And so the Zhou claimed heaven had originally provided the Shang with its right to rule. And then heaven shifted to the Zhou when the Shang rulers ceased to rule with virtue. And then Yin is an alternative name for the Shang people. So when you see Yin, it's an alternative name for the Shang people. So let's move on to the next one. Now they wish to have no opponent in all the kingdom, but they do not seek to attain this by being benevolent. This is like a man laying hold of a heated substance and not having first dipped it in water. It is said in the Book of Poetry, who can take up a heated substance without first dipping it in water? So the use of the word opponent implies an adversary who's an equal match, right? So you see that in line 6. Now they wish to have no opponent in all the kingdom. So as is generally true, having no opponent means also having no match. And so this citation from the Book of Poetry is in the context that one must concern oneself with the need for careful planning before taking action. So in essence, chapter 7, the entire chapter 7 is presenting how the subjugation of one state to another is determined at different times by the mandate of heaven. And thus a prince's only assurance for, security and prosperity is in his being benevolent. So I'll stop here. Did anybody have a comment or thought they'd like to share?
Where does the mandate from heaven come from that they always refer to? Is it something they, and maybe Master can explain that, but is it something that is just written because of history writers or because of some insight or direction that was given from some source? I've always wondered about that.
Yeah, my personal comment would be winners always write the history books, right? So if you're a winner, you can say what you want, right? So yeah, of course, heaven gave me the mandate.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll jump in and share a couple of comments where King Wen's father is King Wen. King Wan. I don't know. Well, what did they use? Okay, the Zhou dynasty. Okay.
I think King Wu, right? King Wan.
King Wu's father is King Wan. Okay. Yeah. He's the one that was put in jail in Shang dynasty by the late emperor. And he is the one who added or deciphered the I Ching, the book of change.
Yeah.
Okay, and they have the 64 hexagrams that was originally Fuxi. That's the beginning of the Tao, the lineage in the written one. Some of us in our temple, it was for Fuxi, the heavenly 8 hexagrams. And King Wan is the one that completed the earthly 8 hexagrams. So 8 times 8, the for them to becomes the 64, which is the total of the Tao lineage is the 64 patriarchs from since the Green Yang stage until our matriarch and patriarch. Okay, that's the totally 64 of them. Okay, so at that time when they were doing that, that is when they were calling, before King Wu actually went and defeat the Song dynasty, he actually held back until the time that was determined to be the right timing. When they determine the right timing is not only based on the oracle, but at that time, they also look at the world events at that time and how the people are, how do you say, how the people are, the sentiment of the people towards the government at that time, or the sovereignty at that time. And then finally, they said, okay, now is the time to overthrow the Song dynasty. And they used 1,000, I think it was 1,000 army against 10,000 armies or something. It was, they were, the military force that they have on hand was much less than the Song dynasty. But because of the sentiment of the people, because people were tired of the tyranny rule of the Song dynasty, so they basically, they don't need the military force. When they come, people will turn the city over to the Zhou dynasty. So that's how the Song dynasty was basically lost, because they lost the favor of the people. And that's when Mencius in the beginning was talking about the government and being benevolent. That is what he was referring to, because it was not conquered by the military power, but actually it was overthrown by the people at that time. It's not like, they have a great force and they took over and then bombed them or anything like that. It was actually the people was turning against the government at that time because of the tyrant rules that they put in place. So I hope that this helps with the mandate of heaven. But actually, they did use the oracles in the book of I Ching to determine what is possible good timing. But they also did look at the current events as well.
Yeah, they use the oracles and they use astronomy.
Yes, at that time they do, and then
astronomy as well.
right, and then you have to look at the here they talk about people were, what are they talking about? Put out the libations, like libations. It's just like offerings. They're doing the given to heaven, and they were offering to ask heaven, okay, send us a savior, that kind of thing. And so Zhou dynasty King Wen show up and they say, okay, here's the answer.
Here's your libations.
Yeah.
Here's your libations. How can we help?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Okay, thank you very much. And anybody else like to share a thought? Okay. Mencius said, how is it possible to speak with those princes who are not benevolent? Their perils they count safety, their calamities they count profitable, and they have pleasure in the things by which they perish. If it were possible to talk with them, whoso violate benevolence, how could we have such destruction of states and a ruin of families? So this passage is essentially about the fact that a prince is the agent of his own ruin by his vicious ways and refusing to be counseled, right? So, and you see that as, how is it possible to speak with those princes who are not benevolent? So not being willing to be counseled, okay? So that's how I see this this first passage. Did anybody have a comment that they'd like to share before I go on to the next one? Okay, so there was a boy singing, when the water of the Xianglong is clear, it does to wash the strings of my cap. When the water of the Xianglong is muddy, it does to wash my feet. Confucius said, hear what he sings, my children. When clear, then he will wash his cap strings, and when muddy, he will wash his feet with it. This different application is brought by the water on itself. So again, these passages present Mencius's view on conditions creating the results, or in this case, conditions determining how something should be applied. Did anybody have a comment that they'd like to make about these two passages?
I hate to keep giving comments.
Okay, go ahead. No problem. Yeah.
This is all situational management. That's all this is talking about, all these things.
Mm-hmm.
You assess the situation and you apply what is needed for the particular situation, rather than holding hard to normal, let's say just normal management, but being aware of the situation and what is needed. And I think strongly of Huinan and how he did that all the time too. Well, that's what I'm getting out of this.
Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, Michael, this is Charles.
Yeah, Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, seems like we have a very good discussion tonight.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I was trying to think, look at the Mencius was talking about, and also talk about the history of when King of Wen and eventually the Zhou dynasty overthrown the Shang dynasty.
Yeah.
And there's not a big fighting because they do the right things. They are not to say, hey, I'm going to challenge you, I'm going to fight you. But they do the right thing, and they just keep on doing the right thing, not only to themselves and to their neighbors. And eventually they win all the people's supporting. So they overthrown the Shang dynasty. And even Shang dynasty have so many people, still they have so many nobles, but they couldn't help. They can just see people's mind is toward or King of Wu or King of Wen, so that the Zhou dynasty is established. And that way, so that is a way of that the Mencius try to use to teach people how to govern, how to make it do the right things, and eventually, and you will have when the time is come up, or you talk about the heavenly decree, then when time is coming, then you will be over. You can start to manage the nation. So that's what he's talking about. That's what I was looking about this, and I was thinking, that's my thought. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Brother Charles. Anybody else? A man must first despise himself, and then others will despise him. A family must first destroy itself, and then others will destroy it. A state must first smite itself, and then others will smite it. So this passage reminds me of a proverb, and it goes like this. one is humiliated by others always because one has brought humiliation upon oneself first, right? So in other words, the individual or the family or the state creates the conditions that bring about this result, right? So it's just a kind of a continuation of what this chapter's been discussing. Does anybody have a comment they'd like to make about this passage?
You know, brother Michael, sister
Yeah.
Aram here. You know how I don't know who said that, but I think it was Gandhi, that no one can hurt you without your consent.
Okay.
And that's how I remember this. Like, it's our, whatever we do, it's end of the day, it starts from within. So negative or positive, it's applicable on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's a good comment. Yeah. Anybody else? This is illustrated in the passage of the Tai Chi. When heaven sends down calamities, it is still possible to escape them. When we occasion the calamities ourselves, it is not possible any longer to live. So this passage is from a lost chapter of the Book of Documents, and it's called the Tai Chi. And the Book of Documents, you know, is one of the 5 classics combined with the 4 books, right? So it's one of the 5 classics of Chinese literature. So it's an obscure compilation of speeches and records of the major political conversations dating back to Confucius's time. And so these speeches typically are between a king and an emperor and his ministers. So anybody have a comment that they'd like to share about this passage? Okay, let's move on. So Mencius said, Che and Chao's losing the throne arose from their losing the people. And to lose the people means to lose their hearts. There is a way to get the kingdom, get the people, and the kingdom is got. There is a way to get the people, get their hearts, and the people are got. There is a way to get their hearts. It is simply to collect for them what they like and not to lay on them what they dislike. The people turn to a benevolent rule as water flows downwards, as wild beasts fly to the wilderness. So the point of these phrases was extending Mencius's emphasis on the authority of one's moral dispositions, right? So that's basically what he's commenting on here. Did anybody have a thought that they'd like to share? Accordingly, as the otter aids the deep waters, driving the fish into them, and the hawk aids the thickets, driving the little birds to them, so Che and Chao aided Tang and Wu, driving the people to them. If among the present rulers of the kingdom there were one who loved benevolence, all the other princes would aid him by driving the people to him. Although he wished not to become sovereign, he could not avoid becoming so. So these 2 figures that are mentioned here, Che and Chao, they were the last rulers of the Xia and Shang dynasties. And of course, their wanton conduct led to their overthrow by Tang, who established the Shang dynasty, and then King Wu, who went on to establish the Zhou dynasty. Did anybody have a comment or a thought they'd like to share at this point? Okay. The case of one of the present princes wishing to become sovereign is like having to seek for mugwort 3 years old to cure a 7-year sickness. If it have not been kept in store, the patient may all his life not get it. If the princes do not set their wills on benevolence, all their days will be in sorrow and disgrace, and they will be involved in death and ruin. So it makes mention of this word mugwort. This was a traditional medicine cured mugwort was applied to the skin and burnt in a process called moxibustion. And this was believed to restore proper circulation of blood and energy to promote healing. So the power of the mugwort was deemed proportional to the years it had been aged. So they talk about mugwort 3 years old, but he's got a 7-year-old sickness. So they're it's not proportional to the age of the length of the sickness. So did anybody have a comment that they'd like to share on this passage? No, okay. The case of the present princess wishing to become sovereign is like the having to seek for, or this is illustrated by what is said in the book of poetry. How otherwise can you improve the kingdom? You will only with it go to ruin. So this citation from the book of poetry, these 2 lines directly follow the 2 lines out of chapter 7. So the essence of this chapter, chapter 9, is that only by being benevolent can a prince raise himself to be sovereign, or even to avoid ruination. Does anybody have a comment they'd like to share before we go to chapter 10? No? Okay. So Mencius said, with those who do violence to themselves, it is impossible to speak. With those who throw themselves away, it is impossible to do anything. To disown in his conversation propriety and righteousness is what we mean by doing violence to oneself. To say, I am not able to dwell in benevolence or pursue the path of righteousness is what we mean by throwing oneself away. Benevolence is the tranquil habitation of man, and righteousness is the straight path. Alas for them who leave the tranquil dwelling empty and do not reside in it, and who abandon the right path and do not pursue it. So here we can note Mencius's use of tranquil of metaphors, right? So he's using a tranquil dwelling as a metaphor for benevolence, and the right path as a metaphor for righteousness. And so these underlie a number of passages throughout the works of Mencius's. So these aren't just used here specifically in this chapter. And what I find interesting is the use of the term violence, right? So is what we mean by doing violence to oneself. And I assume it's basically meaning that it, what you're doing there is you're harming oneself in a destructive manner. So this appears to be some type of warning of sorts, but I'm just kind of curious, in Chinese, what word is actually being used in the place of violence? Does anybody have a thought or an answer for that?
Self-destruction.
Self-destruction, okay. Yeah. Okay, anybody else have a comment or a thought about chapter 10?
What it all strikes to me what was just said in an old phrase, you know, we are sometimes our own worst enemy. And by not being benevolent and not being virtuous, we are in effect our own worst enemy. And that's what struck me about this in just a simple term that you and I have probably heard all of our lives. So simple truths, but in different manner. I think Mencius is really incredible. And why didn't more princes and kings listen to him?
Good question.
They weren't ready. Because they weren't ready.
They weren't ready. Yeah, that's a good answer. Yeah.
They weren't ready because their ego, you know, whatever. I mean, that's the point we all have to ask ourselves too. You talked about self-reflection earlier and self-cultivation or cultivation. You know, were these kings in that not position, in that awareness to be able to do that? And that may be the answer. I don't know what it is, but maybe somebody else has it.
Okay. Thanks, Roger. Anybody else? All right, let's go to chapter 11. Mencius said, the path of duty lies in what is near, and men seek for it in what is remote. The work of duty lies in what is easy, and men seek for it in what is difficult. If each man would love his parents and show the due respect to his elders, the whole land would enjoy tranquility.
Oh, good.
Right, so this is Mencius's constant refrain, right? And that is, morality is easy because it is already what we wish to follow, right? It's in our human nature. And the tranquil prosperity of the kingdom depends on the discharge of the common relationships or the common relations of life. So in essence, living according to the way, in which they call it here the path of duty, right? It's the way, involves nothing more than extending to all people the way one treats one's parents and one's elders. So likewise, the way is not found far away. It's not in the lofty or distant ideals or experiences. And it's not found in obedience to great traditions and rites of the past. Instead, it's uncovered close by, specifically in honoring and deferring to one's parents and elders. And so that's what I take from this. Did anybody have a thought or a comment that they'd like to share with us about chapter 11?
I think the last comment I'll make tonight is that can you give us a little bit of a conclusion, or is that your conclusion? Because we're right at almost time right now, Michael, and I'm glad that we were there, because I thought tonight's interaction by everybody was extremely beneficial.
Yeah, I think the interaction was good. I think it was an interesting topic. Like, as I mentioned at the outset, a lot of people would consider this book 7, to be it wouldn't stand out among any of the other books because it doesn't have all these soaring, philosophical approach or biographical approach or anything. But I think the essence of it is that it's making an argument that good governance is achieved by looking back to and respecting the past great kings and sages. And so that's why he's in this book. It's distinguished by a strong emphasis on the importance of tradition and reverence for the past. And so I'll just leave it at that. If I did not completely cover the topic, I ask for heaven's forgiveness and for the monitor to add his own thoughts. And so I thank everyone for their listening today, their participation. And I pass it back to you, Roger.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, brother. Appreciate it. I'm not going to add any comment because I think the essence of what I had or would have thought became even more dramatic to me when I made it, because it came at the right time for me, and I prefer to do that. But I will ask Master for just a blessing in this last little bit, and any comments she wishes to make for the last bit.
Thank you, Brother Roger. Thank the grace of God and all the heavenly deities. I think our conversation, I have shared my thoughts with all of you and during the class, and just on the mugwort and the sickness, that reminds me of when we're talking about our own karma and why is teacher is so earnest to urge all of us to earn our merits and fulfill our vows. The vows is the strength toward pushing us toward our goal, toward a goal. Whatever your vow is, you could be vowed to help your family or help a person. And that is the strength to push us to do what we can. And while along the way, when we're doing selfless acts, heaven will benefit us will bring here Menzies is talking about very clearly. If the prince, the states are benevolent, then the people will reward you in the same way. So it's like, we often wonder, those who have received the blessing and said, why have my life changed? You have to look at it. Are we using a 3-year muck ward to treat like a 7-year-old sickness? Is that what we're talking about here? So it's really about our own action, our own self reflection upon ourselves, what we really like to, our life to be, or do we have the faith in God, in the saints and the sages, in their words that they have left behind to guide us in the way. To go back, the Menzies is talking about a tranquil house, or are we walking on what kind of path? Are we walking on the right path? Are we seeking the tranquility in God's house? It's up to each one of us to do that. I think today there's the class, and I think everyone has gotten that message. I think when Brother Michael, thank him for putting very good class together, and all the participants bringing everyone's thoughts and make this class more full. Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed today's class. Thank you.
Thank you, Master. I believe in relation to what you said and what Michael said, I think this class was helpful to us in that the interactions gave different perspectives, and those different perspectives added to the understanding that Mencius, I think, was trying to deliver over the centuries to us. And I'm grateful for that message from him and from the participation of everybody tonight. And if there's no other comment, if I could ask Sister Aram to offer those and extinguishing of the lamps at this time.